moderator for today's program will be Ian Curtis. Ian is an associate faculty at W.P. Carey School of Business at Arizona State University. Prior to joining W.P. Carey, Ian's career focused on global public affairs and market analysis and intelligence for companies operating in China and Mexico. Most recently, Ian led the policy and U.S. government affairs teams at the Arizona Chamber of Commerce in China. In this role, he consulted American businesses on the latest investment, trade, and cybersecurity policy developments and developed strategies to engage both U.S. and Chinese governments. Prior to that, Ian worked for a number of organizations in the U.S., Mexico, and Arizona border on border security, immigration, and supply chain efficiencies. He is also a fellow member of PCFR's board. And now to introduce our speaker, Chun Han Wong is the author of Party of One, The Rise of Xi Jinping in China's Superpower Future, and has covered China for the Wall Street Journal since 2014. He was part of a team of reporters named as Pulitzer Prize finalists for their coverage of China's autocratic turn under Xi Jinping. As a journal correspondent in Beijing and Hong Kong, he has written widely on subjects spanning elite politics, Communist Party doctrine, human and labor rights, as well as defense and diplomatic affairs. Born and raised in Singapore, he is a native speaker of English and Mandarin Chinese. He studied international history at the London School of Economics, where he graduated with first-class honors and won the Derby Bryce Prize. Please join us in welcoming Mr. Wong.
Thank you. So, hi, thanks everyone for tuning in. Basically, I'll probably start with a bit of self-introduction. Fareed has very kindly given a brief rundown of my resume. Basically, I moved to Beijing in 2014. I stayed there for 5 years. He's already explained the issues that I've covered. During this time, I was in the first front row seat to see how Xi Jinping basically consolidated power, and tried to deliver his agenda as he started to consolidate and strengthen his position over Chinese politics. During that 5 years, I might cover a range of events, including what would some people consider a pivotal moment in Chinese politics in 2017, a 19th Party Congress, where Xi Jinping essentially made clear that he's going to stay on beyond the 10 years that a lot of people expected that he would get in the top job in China. But then in 2019, I was forced to leave Beijing, partly because of a story, I think actually mainly because of a story I co-wrote with a colleague about Xi Jinping's cousin. This cousin was being scrutinized by the Australian government for his activities there. He was gambling lots of money, tens of millions of dollars at the Crown Casino in Melbourne, sort of money that he wasn't able to account for. He was associating with people, Chinese diaspora in Australia who were believed by authorities to have links to organized crime and money laundering. So we basically wrote that story. The Chinese government did not like that story. And it just so happened that my journalist visa was expiring 1 month after the story came out. And that gave them a very easy opportunity to retaliate in a sense. They did not renew my visa. I was forced to leave. And I moved to Hong Kong, where I continued to cover Chinese politics. In fact, I landed in Hong Kong in the middle of the protests, if you remember at the time, that was going on over an attempt to pass an extradition law that will allow the extradition of criminal suspects from Hong Kong to mainland China. And I started covering those protests. And from there, I continued to write about Chinese politics, about Chinese foreign policy. And now I've relocated back to Singapore, where I continue to do the same job. Maybe I should share a bit about how I came to write this book. Basically, the idea for writing this book started when I was still in Beijing. I was been covering Chinese politics. People would ask me, so could you recommend something? Recommend me a book that would help me, get up to speed with what's going on in China and the Communist Party. And for a long time, I would recommend this book called The Party by Richard McGregor, who was a former Financial Times journalist in Beijing. And it's a very good primer. This book, The Party, basically essentially laid out in very general terms, geared towards explaining to lay audiences about how the Communist Party functions, how it governs China. But the problem with the book is that it came out in 2010, so 2 years before Xi Jinping took power. And since Xi Jinping became General Secretary of the Communist Party in 2012, lots of things have changed. He's essentially restructured Chinese politics around himself. He's made sure that the Communist Party has regained its dominance over Chinese society. So essentially, a lot of the observations and descriptions of what the party was like and how it functioned in Richard McGregor's book had become outdated. And essentially, I saw that there's a market gap. There is a sort of gap for a book that can explain to people how Xi Jinping has changed the party, how Xi Jinping has changed China over the past 10 years. And that's when I started, preparing to write this book. And in a sense, I was trying to write what you call like a spiritual sequel to Richard McGregor's book. And in the book, I essentially attempt to answer four main questions. How Xi Jinping came to power, how Xi Jinping consolidated his power, how he exercises his power, and what he wants to achieve with this power. The book is not meant to be a biography per se, but I do devote the entire chapter to recounting his life from his birth in 1953 to the moment he takes office as General Secretary in late 2012. So this time period obviously would include, how Xi Jinping grew up during Mao Zedong's tumultuous rule, during which Xi Jinping's father, Xi Zhongxun, who's a revolutionary elder, who got purged in 1962, and thereafter, 4 years later, the launch of the Cultural Revolution, basically describing how Xi Jinping during his childhood and early teenage years went through a lot of difficulties, a lot of hardship, from being someone who was the son of a revolutionary, someone who enjoyed relative privilege in the Communist Party system, to someone who became this child of a disgraced official and got persecuted and bullied for it. The book also explores how he went on to join the Communist Party, the sort of lessons he learned as a teenager when he went through this difficult time under Mao, how he got into politics, and his rise from being a county official to regional official and all the way up to national level politics. And basically, I sort of try to explain the many lessons he learned about the nature of power in China, how capricious it is, how fickle it can be, and how he learned to navigate the treacherous game of Communist Party politics. And I think this background is actually very crucial for understanding, Xi's formative experiences and the political culture that he was brought up in, because there are a lot of elements from his past that you can see that he's sort of tapped. He has tried to repurpose some of the lessons he learned, use some of the Maoist tactics that he grew up with and deploying it in his current day governance. The rest of the book, covers broad areas of governance that Xi Jinping has made, significant impact. This includes how he centralized power in his own hands, using anti-corruption purges to instill fear across the bureaucracy to make sure that his directives from Beijing can be implemented down all the way to the grassroots. How he has imposed his vision on the economy, on broader society, how he's tried to forge a more cohesive and singular national identity for China, how he has put Chinese diplomacy on the front foot. Some people, as you may be familiar with, the disgraced wolf warrior diplomacy, basically trying to encourage his diplomats to be more aggressive and be a more forward-leaning in how they pursue and put forward China's positions on global affairs and defend China's interest. And finally, also, it will cover a bit of how Xi Jinping has tried to remake the Chinese military, modernizing Soviet model military and trying to prepare it for 21st century challenges and to present a more robust challenge against the United States, especially in the Asia Pacific. And that's essentially a brief summary of my book, and I'm now happy to take questions.
Chun Han, thank you so much for writing the book. First of all, you stole my first question out of my mouth, which was it was going to be, what's your perception of the book as a continuance of McGregor's work? And that was exactly what I thought of as I think it was chapter 3. I was like, man, this is just a perfect follow on to McGregor's work, because McGregor's book was the first book that I read when I flew to China in 2011, and frankly, it was a rough one to start with because it scared me a bit. But fantastic work. I really commend you on what you've done here, because I think it plays a critical role, as you said, in filling that market gap. There was the first question I have, I'll keep it really broad before there's like a million questions I could ask, and everybody else will too. But there's this one line from your book that I think just summarizes the state of the party and many, many thought leaders in China right now, which was, the line was something like, ideological transformation can solve political and economic problems in China. It was like the perception that the party has or Xi Jinping has at least, towards kind of how to unite the country when it's going through so many changes and volatility and so forth. And I was just kind of hoping that you could kind of speak to that perspective a little bit more. I feel like that's just the sort of strategic empathy, if you will, that is lacking in terms of understanding where the party's coming from today. And I'd love to kind of open it broadly there and just hear you speak more to that kind of sentence that you wrote. It was like the second to last chapter, I think it was, or so.
So I think ideology definitely has become a more important aspect of governance in China under Xi Jinping. A lot of people would describe the way that Xi Jinping governs, it's more important to be read than to be an expert, which is sort of an inversion of what was sort of the prevailing sentiment of how China was functioning during the 30 or so years before Xi Jinping took power, where, under Deng Xiaoping and his immediate successors, there was this belief that pragmatism, expertise, technocratic knowledge was more valued than, sheer ideological loyalty to the Communist Party and Marxist-Leninist principles. So at the time, it seemed to be, being expert is more valuable than being read. People get promoted for delivering on key performance indicators that are more related to economic growth. That's sort of the priorities that the party set. And people who tend to be able to do better in this are sort of those who, in a way, quote unquote, liberate their thinking. They don't necessarily follow ideological principles that the party set. They don't necessarily follow what sort of Marxist socialist principles that the party professes, but are open and willing, and in fact, quite in some ways, go beyond what might be deemed acceptable even in the contemporary society at the time, in trying to pursue economic growth. So they would tolerate certain excesses, they might close an eye to certain unscrupulous practices that companies do in order to ensure that the business environment was conducive to generating jobs, to generating GDP growth. And Xi Jinping sort of was reacting to this messiness that was created by the rapid growth that China was experiencing. He sort of saw that Chinese society was being, in a way, in his words, when there was a meeting in 2011 where he met then Vice President Joe Biden, where he talked about how he thought it's important for China to have a strong centralized leadership, because he saw that in society, the many of these centrifugal social forces that were threatening to pull the country apart. You had a rise in mass protests from people who were sort of the losers from China's rapid growth. You had people who had their land seized by governments, who then selling that land to property developers. You had people who were not getting their wages paid, because the sort of business environment was more conducive towards business owners, and labor rights was not well protected. So there was this sense that China was growing, China was benefiting from this period of relative tolerance and preference for more pragmatic economic governance. But at the same time, there were negative social consequences. There were negative consequences for the party's ability to govern. And Xi Jinping was, in a way, reacting to this. He decided that I need to reinstill control. The party must be in control. The party must be seen as unequivocally dominant across all aspects of society, and sort of to rein in these excesses that was manifesting. So in that sense, ideology has come back to the fore. There was a phrase at the past where you say economics was in command of policymaking. Now politics is in command. What the party demands, what the central leadership, what Xi Jinping himself demands, has to be prioritized, even if it comes at the expense of economic growth to some extent.
Yeah, thank you. And my follow-on question to that is kind of regarding China's perception. I think it's related, but please disagree with me. Let's make this interesting. Is China's perception of security is so domestic focused, and there's the quote or the line of China's external, well, any country's external affairs is an extension of its domestic, but last I saw, domestic security spending was still far above external domestic spending in China. Security forces, paramilitary forces, and so forth, there's just far more concerns about domestic issues than there are external. Could you just speak to that a bit more from this perspective of how the leader's perception of China, their own leadership perspective of their own country is that of a country that's still very much in need of unification, that process might not be done really.
I think we've definitely seen that play out quite dramatically in some places over the past few years. We've seen what happened in Xinjiang, for example, where in 2014, Xi Jinping quite famously, when he went to do an inspection tour, on the last day of his tour, a terrorist attack happened in Urumqi, the capital of Xinjiang. And that in some ways sort of crystallized for him. There is a significant threat here that in his mind needs to be put down with much more vigorous force. And we saw after that, in the years after, maybe not immediately, but there was definitely a ramp up in terms of the assimilation programs that they started to devise. But in some ways, that particular problem, I think they diagnosed it to be more serious. So they used far more aggressive tactics in Xinjiang. In Hong Kong, there's also a problem with this, what they think is the failure to integrate, this former British colony that spent more than 150 years outside of Chinese control and, had been very westernized. It had sort of been, it became this very prosperous city, but under strong Western influence. And that meant that the local society, in the Communist Party's point of view, was very removed, or like sort of their consciousness of being part of China had been diluted. And so therefore, Xi Jinping believed that he had to institute far more stronger tactics to try to bring Hong Kong back into the fold, as they were describing. And I think that accelerated after, in 2014 and 2019, mass anti-government protests broke out. That really crystallized for Xi in his mind that, okay, this problem has gone too far. We need to take more drastic steps to control these secessionist, separatist instincts that they believe to be, proliferating in these areas. So we saw in Hong Kong, most dramatically, I think, was the introduction of the national security law, where it sort of defined four main offenses that would be deemed prejudicial to Chinese national security. And we've seen after that almost, entire wipeout of the pan-democratic movement in Hong Kong, which now I think the consequences are still continuing to play out. As for, there are also other aspects of trying to reimpose this singular Chinese identity that maybe has gotten less headlines. We've seen attempts to step up patriotic education, step up national education, to foster this idea that, China has 56 different ethnic groups, including the Han Chinese ethnic majority. They want to make sure that the other 55 buy into this idea that, they're all part of the great China. They're all part of the China dream, that they're all going to be made more prosperous and, live better lives as long as Xi Jinping and his Communist Party are successful in elevating China's standing in the world. And that includes trying to encourage certain ethnic minority groups to make sure they use standard Mandarin Chinese in schools, make sure that, Mandarin Chinese is more than just a lingua franca. In fact, there's more of discourse that refers to Mandarin as the national language, as opposed to just the common language, which, it is a minor difference, but I think it's a significant one to basically signal that, to be part of the Chinese nation, you have to speak Mandarin, right? You have to speak the language of the majority, and to be able to truly identify yourself as Chinese, you have to be able to speak the national rather than just the common language. So I think we've seen this play out across various regions of China in various sectors over the past 10 years. And I think we can only anticipate that, there will be more of such attempts to foster, to try to encourage and consolidate this singular Chinese identity. You talk about unification briefly. I think you'll be referring to Taiwan. I think Taiwan is sort of a bit of a different challenge for the Communist Party and Xi Jinping, because it is, by most definitions, essentially a separate political entity. Some people go so far as to call it a separate country, which obviously the Communist Party will object to. But that presents Xi a much more difficult challenge to try to realize his dream of unifying Taiwan with the mainland. Whether that involves going to war, that's very hard to say. I know that in recent years, there's been a lot of discussions about the risk of conflict over Taiwan. What I would say is to try to think about this not just in terms of Xi Jinping's desire to unify Taiwan, but also how that will practically play out. People talk a lot about the risk of invasion. I would say that we need to bear in mind that war is not a means to an it's not an end of itself, right? War is a means to an end. War is a way to build the peace you want to see. What sort of peace can the Communist Party build if they decide to use force to unify Taiwan? That is, I think, something worth considering, because as we've seen in Xinjiang, using sort of harsh methods can create blowback. That you can create a lot more resentment, and the cost of it has to be paid in very strict and, quite frankly, in some ways very brutal methods used to pacify this land that you've now brought under your control. So is that something that the Communist Party can live with? I think that's something we can think about. I'm not willing to make predictions, because I think it's a bit of a fool's errand to make very precise predictions of what the Communist Party would do. Given that it's a very dynamic situation and it's a black box system in Beijing, we don't really know exactly how precisely they think about certain issues. But I think what we can do is to try to educate ourselves and make sure we think along lines that we think they are operating along, and we can sort of understand how they look at issues. And based on that knowledge, we can better assess and understand what they might do.
That's fantastic. Yeah, thank you. I love it. And actually, I wasn't thinking of unification of Taiwan when I mentioned unification. I was thinking more of all the activities they're doing in Inner Mongolia, Ningxia. There's still these perceptions in the leadership that they still haven't even figured out the hinterland, the mainland part of it in many ways, which your book did a great job of highlighting. So thank you. I'll ask one more question, and then we've got a whole slew of questions rolling in. This is fantastic. And so my question is about Xi's rise to power and his evolution or his leading the evolution of the party. And I'm kind of naturally a systems thinker. And so I always think of, what are the drivers behind changes in ecosystems and organizations and such. And as your book lays out, even many Chinese thought leaders all thought, okay, we're going to have a clear transition process. We've kind of figured this out. The party works in a certain way. We kind of know the direction that Xi Jinping will take because he was chosen by his predecessor, yada, yada, yada. Obviously, that didn't play out. Pretty much everybody was wrong. But you highlight Yang Jieqi's theory on authoritarianism and how it kind of goes back and forth, or, the chapters of authoritarian systems. Which I thought was lovely. I'm going to look that up now. That's on my follow-up reading list. So did we miss? Did just not enough people read Yang Jieqi's work, or did we just fundamentally read wrong signals? I guess do not enough people know this theory of authoritarian governments? Do we just not have the right framework, or were the signals just wrong?
I think it's hard to. I mean, if with hindsight, we can quite clearly see where mistakes were made, and there's a lot of over optimism in assessing Xi Jinping in the immediate years before he took power. But I think Xi Jinping did help us. But he definitely did help himself in the sense that he hid his true intentions really well. I mentioned in the book that there are people whose fellow princelings, princelings being this phrase that you use to describe the descendants of senior party officials and revolutionaries. So this group of people, the princelings, there's some of them. I mean, it's a diverse group, but there's a significant number of them which will be considered, I think, in the Chinese political spectrum anyway, liberals, right? They are the ones who think China should adopt some liberalization of this political system. China should try to push for more rule of law. China should adopt more Western style, separation of powers. Maybe not completely. They also don't believe in bringing down the Communist Party, but I think at least they think within the Communist Party there is scope for some mini democratization. So these are the kind of people who thought, and they knew Xi Jinping. Like a lot of them grew up with him. Their parents knew each other, and so I think they sort of projected their wishes onto him. And Xi Jinping did nothing to dispel these projected ideas about him in how he interacted with them. And in fact, Xi Jinping used to meet some of these people quite regularly to discuss affairs of the state. They also just to get together because they are acquaintances and friends. But after Xi Jinping took power, I remember speaking to this princeling who complained to me that it's practically impossible to meet Xi Jinping after Xi Jinping became leader. Xi Jinping essentially isolated himself to some extent. He basically cut off informal channels to reach him. If you want to talk to him, you have to go through formal channels. In some ways, this is understandable because you don't want to be in a situation where people try to lean on, past friendships and, sort of acquaintances and, those kinship to try to put pressure or lobby the leader. You want things to be done in a more proper and organized and structured way. But, these princelings essentially felt, in a way betrayed. First of all, by the fact that they thought he was someone and he turned out to be someone else. And the fact that he sort of cut them loose after he became leader. So if these people who knew Xi Jinping well, these people were his friends, these people hung out with him for many years before he took power, and they could not see what he was going to become. I think for outsiders, that challenge is, exponentially more difficult. But just what that leaves us with is that we have to now sort of be very focused in what we look at in trying to assess what Xi Jinping wants to do. I think the fortunate thing for us is that, as I quote Robert Carroll in my book, from a line from his biography of Lyndon Johnson, where basically he says, power reveals, right? The moment someone gets power, the need to conceal his true intentions decreases. He doesn't need to pretend anymore. He doesn't need to hide what he really wants to achieve. So Xi Jinping has now entered a phase of his career, of his leadership, where I think when it comes to the macro declarations, when he talks about what he wants China to become, the sort of big picture goals, you can't take him at face value. You can't take him seriously. And in terms of what he wants to achieve, that he wants to make China a more economically prosperous, diplomatically consequential, and militarily powerful country, that's exactly what we're seeing. So there's no longer a need to say hide or pretend he's doing something else. Now we're seeing him trying to deliver on what his true goals are. Obviously, it's difficult to predict specific policies because it is a black box system. Only true insiders would have direct access to that policymaking process and be able to predict specific policies to come up, on a day-to-day or week-to-week or month-to-month basis. But I think the long-term goals are very clear. We just have to do our best to try to triangulate information, to try to make better assessments and predictions about what might come in the shorter term.
Super, thank you. So I'm going to start synthesizing some questions that we're getting in from the audience here. We have two questions regarding kind of the impact of trade and liberalization from Arnulfo Acedo and Dr. Annette Padilla. And so I'll just synthesize the two together is kind of, can you speak to the pressures on the party from the economics of the modern day? There's been so much tightening on trade as well as financial flows. How is that, what kind of pressure is that putting on the party more generally?
I think we definitely can see how much concern the party has shown over the economy. The big change that happened in the past year, obviously, was the transition from zero COVID. If you remember, China for 3 years essentially had this very draconian, very harsh approach to containing the virus within its borders. So that involved things like lockdowns of entire cities, things that are quite unimaginable and quite impractical to do unless you have this very strong political machinery to enforce it. But China does have this machinery, and they enforced it for quite a long time. And for a while it worked. It did contain the virus, but then once Omicron came along, it made all this, sort of top-down methods quite ineffective. So, but I think that manifested in some social tensions. We saw what we call the white paper protests. People went on the streets holding up white pieces of paper because even writing any slogan on it would be directly deemed as potentially treasonous. So the fact that they were just even on the streets in itself was enough to convey the fact that they're very unhappy what's going on. That was one aspect, one factor in the party changing course. But the other important factor in this is the fact that zero COVID was devastating to the Chinese economy. Growth was slumping. The real estate market was already showing signs of, crumbling. And the decisive factor was, zero COVID had actually disrupted supply chains and disrupted production, disrupted manufacturing to such an extent that, the status quo simply could not go on anymore. Xi Jinping had to change course, and he did. So over a span of weeks, many of the measures essentially disappeared, right? Like they disappeared so quickly that some people were complaining that, you know, they went from zero COVID to almost virtually 100% COVID. Like they didn't care where the virus was going. That itself, I think, is a reflection of how seriously they took the economic problem. They realized that this simply could not go on. They had to change course to start engineering an economic recovery. Obviously, as we know from the past few months in terms of the data, that hasn't really panned out. The post-pandemic recovery has not gone the way that a lot of people had expected. But at the same time, we see Xi Jinping still clinging on to certain principles he sets for his vision of how the economy should be run. He talks a lot about this. This is some of the phrases he uses, for example, is high-quality development, new development concept, which essentially is, you know, he doesn't want to repeat the mistakes of his predecessor. His predecessor, you know, Hu Jintao, was known for being sort of, you know, easy money, you know, like turn on the credit taps. You know, when the economy needed stimulus, he was willing to put it in, and in very large amounts. That sort of created a lot of the problems we see today: overinvestment, excess industrial capacity, wasteful investments, and that's sort of the problems that Xi Jinping has sort of set a stake out to say, I'm different from the previous guys. I will do things differently. I will not make the same mistakes. But that sort of directive, this sort of goes back to the point about ideology over, you know, pragmatism, that, you know, having laid down this demand, you know, I want to have a higher quality development. You know, I don't want to, you know, create welfareism. I don't want to do handouts. I don't want to, you know, saddle the economic system with more financial risk and greater debt. That sort of limits the playbook that policymakers currently have. You know, they have to try to deliver economic recovery without some of the techniques, without some of the tools that they were able to use previously, or at least if they could use these tools, but not in a way that, you know, would engender the negative externalities that came along with them when, you know, they deployed at this less, you know, in a more wanton way when Hu Jintao was in charge. So I think that has created certain problems. We saw, like, you know, people have predicted a massive stimulus for some time now, but China has yet to deliver this big bazooka stimulus. I think in large part because the political strictures that Xi Jinping has set is to avoid this sort of big bazooka stimulus. That created problems. We won't do that again. Please try to come up with new tools that can address our problems without recreating the issues that we saw in the past. So, you know, to answer the question more directly, I think, yes, the economy is a key factor. It is arguably the number one concern right now. In fact, we will probably get to see a bit more of the solutions they're going to try to come up with, potentially as soon as next month, when the Communist Party Central Committee is due to meet for what you would call the third plenum, which is typically this meeting where they will chart the economic policy for the medium term, about for the next 5 years or so. So a lot of people are looking forward to that meeting to see what comes out, what sort of measures Xi Jinping can come up with, and whether, you know, that actually can bring confidence back, you know, into the Chinese economy.
Yeah, thank you. A follow-on question, very similar, but more kind of the human, cultural, societal kind of aspect is, and kudos to Sam for reading the article. I saw it come out. I read the headline. Was Evan Osnos came out about the Malay age of Malays in China. And I've experienced this myself, just hearing stories of people who are still able to visit China and meet up with entrepreneurs, you know, folks kind of outside on the edges of the party, perhaps, but still very wealthy. You know, there's a lot of grumbling in this kind of southern China side of things, if you will. Can you speak to that? Like how you know, there's a lot of grumbling, right? There's the post-coronavirus post, and now this sort of, what am I going to do with my money? And you spoke about the you know, the curse of being an entrepreneur. Now there's always a sword over your head. What is, you know, what is the human aspect of that? Could you speak to that a little bit?
So I think the Evan Osnos essay is, you know, is circulated really widely. There's a lot of discussion about it. I would say it does capture the sort of sentiment that has been quite prevalent for some time. I would say the last maybe 7 or 8 months, if not longer, that there's this sense of disillusionment and lack of, you know, confidence in the future. given what has happened under Xi Jinping, particularly with, I think the trigger for a lot of that was the pivot from zero COVID. People saw for the first time like, oh, okay, so maybe the government doesn't really know what it's doing when it comes to, political management and the pandemic controls and economic management. A lot of the myths that, they sort of put on the government in terms of its ability to correctly assess the broader economic situation, that sort of went away, and people realized that, okay, so our confidence perhaps was misplaced. At the same time, the business environment was also hit by a series of national security-driven law enforcement events. As you remember, back in March, this due diligence company, a New York headquartered due diligence company called Mintz Group, its Beijing office was raided, and 5 Chinese employees there were detained. Subsequently, we saw similar raids being publicized, for example, about CapVision, which is this consulting company that connects clients with experts and works a lot with foreign companies as well. They were also subject to national security-focused police raids. And we've also heard about a number of exit bans, a number of detentions. For example, there was a Japanese executive with a pharmaceutical company called Astellas who was detained for national security grounds. All these events sort of increased the uncertainty. There's perceptions of risk in doing business in China, which definitely did not help confidence, which is already suffering from the current state of economic malaise that China is going through. So you combine these factors all together, sort of, I think that it contributed to this. In some ways, it became a self-reinforcing dynamic. People are losing faith in the party's ability to manage the economy. Other things that they see the party is doing in terms of national security makes them more worried about their personal safety or their company's ability to function in China. All these different concerns came meshed together. And I think we're now in this, as Evan Osno's article described, this malaise. I would caution, though, that, this sentiment, while I think is very real, and, a lot of people you talk to, whether academics or business people who visit China in the last few months, they all feel it. But I think it's very hard to be extrapolated beyond a certain demographic. I think it's definitely felt in the business community. It's definitely felt in the entrepreneurial class in China. It's definitely felt in certain pockets of, say, young urban Chinese who find it very difficult to find jobs. As you know, youth unemployment right now in China is at a record high. But beyond this group, I think there are still significant sectors of China who are not as badly affected by what's going on. And I think for them, they are, I would say, perhaps on the lower rungs of society. They are relatively poor, they are in the countryside, or they're still in parts of the economy that are still functioning relatively well. And they may have very different perceptions of what's going on. They arguably, I think, a lot of them, in fact, perceive the central leadership differently than what the elites or the business class would perceive. Because I think the political elites and business elites, they feel their interests being damaged. Whereas I think there's still people else in other parts of Chinese society who think their interests are still being looked after. It may not be as good as they had hoped it would be, but I think they will probably be they're still relatively satisfied with what's going on. So I wouldn't want to say like what Evan Osno's described as like truly encompassing, a truly representative take on how, the mood across all of China is. But I would say it's a very, I think, accurate depiction of how this particular segment of society is feeling.
That's great. Thank you. I was going to ask another question, but I'll follow on that. Is that there's a couple questions about personality, like a Maoist personality being built around Xi, the use of his books, The Governance of China, and others that were ostensibly written by him, and yeah.
some of them are behind me.
There you go. So there's this perception of power that has been built around Xi, and he's a one-man band. Is there a parallel? So there's two questions. Can you speak to that, and how I guess how should we perceive that? How real is that? Is he really the next Mao? I think I think some know the answer, but is he really the next Mao? So that's the exciting question. And the second one that I think is also of equal kind of stature is there a way for Americans to to put it in the American paradigm, as Americans are experiencing their day to day, is Xi Jinping sort of because this comes around with some friends that I speak with, is like he's kind of like China's version of Donald Trump, in that he's brash, he's all about holding the power himself, he's all about populism, making the people happy, and crushing entrepreneurs that aren't following the will of the country. We need to make China strong again, pursuing the China dream, this sorts of thing. Is that a parallel that might be helpful for some Americans who are trying to wrap their brain around Xi Jinping? So those are my two questions for you: is how real is the personality of him, and is he the next Mao? And then is that a paradigm that Americans that might help Americans understand Xi through?
So I'll answer the second question first. In terms of what Xi represents, I think at a very simple level, I think it's useful to know to compare the China dream with Make America Great Again. So essentially, the China dream is to make China great again. Right? That is essentially what it means. China was once a great imperial power, centuries ago. That came apart thanks to Western imperialism. The Opium War that started in 1839 and which eventually led to the Qing dynasty losing Hong Kong to the British. That precipitated this series of unequal treaties that where foreign powers came up and tore up China and exploited China, put China down. And that sort of historical wrong is essentially what Xi Jinping and the Communist Party have tried to right. They tried to right this wrong ever since they came to power in 1949. And Xi Jinping's message is, we're almost there. We're on the cusp of righting all these historical wrongs that have been done against China. So if you stick with me and trust my agenda, trust my ability to govern, we will make China great again. That's essentially a very simple way of explaining what the China dream is. So in that sense, he's making a similar appeal to what Donald Trump does, right? He's appealing to this nostalgia for this idea of China being once this great power, and we're trying to bring it back there. And Make America Great Again fundamentally is making a similar nationalistic appeal to his supporters. Whether you agree or disagree with him, I think you can draw some parallels between the core of those messages, right? Between Make America Great Again and the China Dream. At the core of both messages is a very similar appeal, right? We support me, back my governance, back my authority, and I will deliver you a return to these glory days that we once had. So I hope that answers the second question. As for the first question, I think the Mao comparison is made many times, and I think some ways it is a fair comparison to make, in the sense that Xi Jinping does borrow a lot of tactics from Mao Zedong. It is the only true education he had. If you read my book, you will see how I describe how Xi Jinping's formal education was highly disrupted. First by the Cultural Revolution, which meant that a lot of schools stopped functioning. He was sent down to Shaanxi, which is this northern central province in China, is very impoverished, and where he learned to deal with hardship. He essentially spent 7 years there. He had to learn how to do farm labor, menial labor, which he never had to do as a privilege, during his privileged childhood and as someone growing up in Beijing. So that experience really, is crucial for him. But at the same time, during that period, he had first-class education in Chinese politics. As someone who grew up in a political family, someone who saw how political fights are fought in the Communist Party, someone who saw how Mao Zedong exercised power, and defeated political enemies. Essentially, his one true education is in how politics functions in China. And a lot of the tactics he has used today, you can see a straight line between that and what Mao Zedong used to do, basically borrowing some of the language, some of the rhetoric, some of the tactics. So the comparison in that sense, I think, is fair. Where to say Xi Jinping has a kind of personality, I think that needs to be a bit more nuanced in how we look at it. Mao Zedong's cult of personality, I think, is qualitatively different from what Xi Jinping is trying to make around himself. Mao Zedong after all, is the founder of the PRC. He's a revolutionary. He was one of the founding members of the Communist Party. He was at the inaugural Congress in 1921 when the CCP was founded. And, his success in, defeating Kuomintang, defeating Chiang Kai-shek, and founding the PRC gives them his essentially virtually unlimited reservoir of political capital, right? He could never lose it. You essentially made China, or communist China, what it is today. There's none of his rivals could take that away from him. He will always have this basically bottomless reservoir of charisma and political capital you can call upon to use. In fact, that's what he did in 1966 when he launched the Cultural Revolution. When his personal power had sort of been restricted by some of his fellow peers in the leadership, he decided to summon the masses, activate ordinary Chinese people around him. That led to the rise of militant Red Guards who persecuted, political rivals on Mao's behalf. Whereas Xi Jinping can't really do that. Xi Jinping essentially is a creature of the party. He has no independent source of political capital. He has no independent source of legitimacy. He is there because the Communist Party decided to put him in charge. So he cannot turn on the party. He has no independent sources of authority or charisma that is divorced from this political machine that he commands. So it's not as if he can go out and make a direct appeal to the people to say like support me, and sort of act independently of the party. Everything he does has to go through the Communist Party, its machinery, its propaganda apparatus. Without that, in some ways you could say he has not much power. So I think that's the key difference to understand between Mao and Xi Jinping. Mao actually has this emotional connection with many ordinary Chinese people, whereas Xi Jinping has to manufacture that connection through propaganda, through the party machinery. So that's a qualitative difference between what Xi is doing and what Mao Zedong used to enjoy. And that I think has practical effects on the extent to which Xi Jinping can use this image, to exploit the support that is engineered around him. So there are limits to that, which, I think can't really approximate to the levels that Mao Zedong used to enjoy.
Thank you. I think you answered the questions masterfully, including my little grenade there. So well done.
No problem.
Next question, summarizing two other ones, is regarding kind of the international community, or rather foreign governments that are engaging with China these days. I guess the way to ask it is kind of what levers seem to work now when engaging with Chinese government officials in these international settings. There's been a global reset, if you will, or at least recalibration of how governments want to engage with China and the Chinese government, given perceptions regarding the party and its influence and the change of kind of direction that some see in China's international engagement. What works from your perspective, from a foreign, if I'm a foreign government official sitting down with others at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, like what's the give and take? How has that changed, and what seems to work today that probably, what works today that might not have worked before, or vice versa?
That's actually quite a difficult question to answer, and in fact, a lot of my friends who are engaged in diplomacy and foreign services in many different countries, they've been grappling with this over the past 10 years, which is, it's very hard to engage with China because the Chinese foreign ministry, first of all, is not that powerful a ministry. It is more of an implementation agency. It's not a policy-making agency per se. Obviously, its top people have a seat at the table to some extent. They can make suggestions. They can make submissions to the leadership, which then would be debated at a higher level beyond their pay grade. But insofar as the foreign ministry day-to-day operations are concerned, they are meant to implement. They don't really have their own decision-making authority when it comes to matters of foreign affairs. So this actually makes it quite difficult to try to, sort of engage, try to sort of influence China through the day-to-day engagements with the Chinese diplomats, because they're not really having any authority to do anything. In fact, some people even have questioned their ability to reflect the reality of what's going on to their leadership, because bureaucrats are incentivized to report certain things. They may not wish to report certain bad news to their bosses for fear of consequences for themselves. So there are questions being raised about how, what is the quality of the information that is being passed up to the top leadership ranks from these people, right? Whether it's the foreign ministry, whether it's the Ministry of Commerce that deals with a lot of the trade discussions with the US and other Western countries, from the intelligence services that China has. So there's a lot of question marks being raised about, is Xi Jinping getting the right information? And is he making the right assessments and decisions based on that information? But in terms of ability to influence China, you actually mentioned this quote in the book earlier in our discussion, which is, external affairs is extension of the internal affairs, right? So I think one of the big changes we've seen in the US-China relationship over the past few months, as we know, there's been a lot of talk about potential summit meeting between Xi Jinping and Biden in San Francisco during the APEC leaders meeting next month. And so far, I think the signs are good that this will probably happen because there's been signaling from both sides that they want this to happen. The Chinese have sent senior officials to the US. Wang Yi is due to visit Washington this week. The US have sent a bunch of senior officials to Beijing. And in fact, when Gavin Newsom right now, governor of California, is in Beijing, and Xi Jinping met him yesterday. So there's a lot of positive signals coming out, and that is such a stark turnaround from what the relationship was like earlier this year when the alleged spy balloon was floating over America, right? So that really screwed up a lot of the ongoing discussions between the two governments. The relationship essentially tanked. And now we've seen over the past few months this fairly dramatic turnaround. I think that a lot of it is driven by China's domestic priorities. The Chinese economy is not in a good position, is looking pretty somber right now. And I think they've decided that we do not need further complications in the external environment. Domestic problems are bad enough. Let's not make problems for ourselves outside of China. Let's try to repair some of the relationships that we've damaged over the past few years. Even if you can't improve them to an ideal situation, you want to make sure at least you limit the damage it can do. So we've seen China improve relationship with Australia. We've seen a stabilization of the relationship with the US. I think that is in large part driven by what's going on domestically. It's not that, I personally don't feel optimistic on the US-China relationship long-term because I think a lot of the fundamental disagreements have not been resolved. And I'm not sure there's any clear solution in terms of how they can be resolved. So I think the longer-term outlook for US-China relationship is still one that's more fraught with tensions. Maybe some cooperation on where they can find common ground, but primarily driven by competition. So this recent rapprochement, so to speak, I think is driven by domestic issues. And I think insofar as other countries can try to influence China, I think perhaps one way is to try to identify, what's going on in China domestically that can be used or can be amplified in a way that will be beneficial in trying to steer China towards, a sort of, more common ground in bilateral relationships with that particular country.
Super. And thank you. You answered my next question as well that I was going to ask that somebody else raised. We have just a few more minutes, so I'll ask one quick question and we'll give a round of applause and thank you. My last question is, how hard is it to cover Beijing and China from Singapore?
It's not easy, I have to say. In fact, I covered this in the book as well in the afterwards. So if you're interested, you can see a more lengthy response right there. So Singapore, obviously, I'm not in the country. I'm not in Beijing. If in an ideal world, I would be there because that is where things happen. It is the capital. It is where you can get to meet people who are closer to the action, so to speak. But absence of that, not being able to be there, I think it's still possible to do reporting from a distance. Obviously, you suffer in terms of not being able to do face-to-face interviews. You can't meet ordinary people so easily. But there's still ways to get at what's going on. There's open source information. I think open source research is still an important avenue for trying to understand what's going on, because you have to think about how essentially the Communist Party is a 98 million member organization. Of course, there are internal directives and documents they will never get to see because they're secret. But Xi Jinping, when he wants to send a macro message, you want to send a big picture message to his party members, he does so in the clear. He does so through state media. Whether it's through the form of like editorials, commentaries written by senior officials under Xi, there are messages that's being sent to the country and to the party that is being broadcast for everybody. Anyone can read it, even us. So from there, we can definitely detect, subtle shifts in language or shifts in priorities, the emergence of a new issue that the Communist Party leadership seems to be more concerned about. This sort of open source research is beneficial, and I think it's still effective to the large extent. It's just that our ability to get inside information to supplement this research is much diminished, because obviously you can't really make, very clear predictions about near-term policy changes just from open source research. You don't know exactly what you may be able to identify a problem that they're concerned about, but you don't know exactly what sort of policy is going to roll out to deal with that problem. That can only come from informed people within the government who are actually working on these policies. So our ability to get at this inside, workings is much diminished, but I think there are still avenues for triangulating, information about China and decision-making in China that we can use. We just have to be a bit, I think, circumscribed in how much, predictions we can build on this information, because it is a black box system. Our ability to understand it is limited by nature. So what I'm saying is perhaps with a bit more humility in what we can find out, but making sure our methods are robust and that we can be confident that what we do know is accurate and is a sound basis for making assessments about China.
Thank you. And as you finish your book, this work is more important than ever as it becomes more and more difficult to do so. So thank you, Chun Han, for your ongoing work and for writing this fantastic book. I highly recommend it for anybody who's looking to catch up on China. So everybody can give a virtual round of applause